The year was 1943. Across the Atlantic, Europe lay in ruins, its cities smoldering from endless bombings, its people scarred by years of relentless conflict. Yet thousands of German soldiers found themselves transported far from that devastation, to a place they had only heard about in propaganda films or whispered rumors, the United States of America. Their journey began with surrender on the battlefield, but it ended on ships crossing the ocean, the rhythmic hum of engines replacing the roar of artillery. As the ships docked in quiet American ports, these prisoners stepped into a world they could scarcely comprehend. The war that had defined their lives felt both near and impossibly distant. Imagine being one of them, stepping off a transport train into the vast American heartland. The air smelled of pine and earth instead of smoke and gunpowder. Instead of destroyed buildings and starving civilians, there were wide fields, small towns, and the sound of laughter from people untouched by invasion. Barbed wire fences stretched across the landscape, enclosing newly built camps where order and routine would govern the lives of men who once marched through conquered cities. To the guards, these camps were simply part of the military system. To the prisoners, they were another kind of battlefield, one fought not with weapons, but with endurance and memory. Inside the camps, daily life followed a steady rhythm. Prisoners woke early to the sound of whistles and commands, their uniforms replaced by plain work clothes stamped with large PW letters. They performed labor duties, attended roll calls, and received their meals on schedule. The US Army enforced discipline, but also a curious form of normalcy. Compared to what many had expected, it was not brutal. The food was sufficient, the treatment humane, and the routine stable. It was in this controlled environment that something unexpected began to emerge. Something that would mark their memories far more deeply than any act of punishment or reward. It began with a faint sound, drifting across the dusty yards of the camp. At first, it was barely noticeable, a melody from a distant radio or perhaps a guard humming to himself during patrol. But for the prisoners, it was striking. Music, played so freely and casually, had become rare in wartime Europe. What they heard was unlike the marching songs or patriotic anthems they had been raised on. It was softer, playful, and strange. American jazz, swing, and folk tunes floated through the air, carried by the wind and amplified through loudspeakers that once blared military orders. In that unlikely place, the sound of music began to reshape the silence of captivity. For many prisoners, this first encounter with American sound was a moment of dissonance. They had been taught to view their captors as crude or soulless, yet here was something alive and expressive. The rhythms moved differently, the harmonies unpredictable. Even those who did not understand the lyrics could feel the emotion behind them. It was music that seemed to celebrate freedom itself, something the prisoners no longer possessed. In the evenings, when work was done and lights dimmed, some men found themselves humming the tunes they had heard earlier in the day. It was as though the music had seeped through the fences and into their thoughts. The American guards, too, began to notice the effect. What started as background noise soon became a quiet form of communication. A guard might bring a portable radio closer to the fence, letting the sound spill into the camp. Prisoners gathered near the wire, not to plot escape, but to listen. Sometimes, an officer would order the volume lowered, but often it was allowed to continue. The camp, once dominated by the clatter of boots and shouted commands, now echoed with songs. Each note carried with it a subtle message, that even in captivity, the world was larger than the war that divided them. Weeks turned into months, and the soundscape of the camps grew richer. Musicians among the prisoners began to recreate what they had heard, tapping rhythms on makeshift drums or plucking strings fashioned from scrap materials. Others sang in low voices during the evening roll calls, blending German folk tunes with bits of American melody. The guards listened, amused and curious. In this strange enclosed world, music had become the most unlikely of bridges. It reminded both sides that life continued beyond uniforms and fences. Beneath the surface of military control, something deeply human was unfolding. To a viewer today, it might seem ordinary that men turned to music in captivity, but for those German POWs, it was an act of quiet defiance and rediscovery. The same men who once marched in lockstep to martial anthems were now drawn to the unstructured joy of American rhythm. It stirred a longing for home and peace, yet it also awakened curiosity about the country that held them. In the middle of an unfamiliar land, surrounded by enemies who treated them with unexpected civility, they began to experience the war from a new perspective. The fences still stood tall, but within them, the first notes of something transformative had begun to play. By the end of that first winter in America, the camps no longer felt entirely like prisons. Snow fell gently on the barracks' roofs, muffling the usual sounds of military life. From one building came the faint strains of a harmonica, playing what might have been a German lullaby. From another, the rhythm of a swing tune someone had learned by ear. The guards paused to listen, and for a brief moment, the war seemed to recede. The prisoners were still captives, but they were no longer only soldiers. They were men, listeners, musicians, and dreamers, finding fragments of humanity within the wire that held them. That was how it began, the story of the music in US camps, the story the German POWs would never forget. When the German prisoners first settled into their new routines, the shock of capture had barely worn off. Many still carried the weight of propaganda that painted America as a land of greed and moral decay, a place of mechanical soldiers without culture or discipline. They expected hostility, perhaps even vengeance. Yet what they found was different. The guards followed strict orders, but they treated the men with a kind of detached respect. Food was fair, shelter was clean, and medical care was provided. The prisoners, raised under the rigid ideology of the Reich, could not understand how their supposed enemies could be both victors and humanitarians. The contrast between their expectations and reality created an inner conflict for many. How could an enemy so feared by the German state show compassion? Inside the barracks, debates broke out in whispered tones. Some prisoners insisted it was manipulation, a trick to weaken their loyalty. Others felt quietly moved by the strange sense of decency that surrounded them. The loudspeakers that once broadcasted orders now played American radio programs. The prisoners listened in silence to the easy laughter of voices and to the music that followed. Music full of energy, spontaneity, and color. It was nothing like the orchestrated marches of the homeland. It was alive, unpredictable, and utterly foreign. For men who had spent years in a world defined by control, that freedom of sound felt almost dangerous. Jazz, swing, and blues defied the rigid patterns of German composition. Improvisation was at the heart of it, musicians bending notes and rhythms in ways that would have been condemned in Nazi Germany as undisciplined or degenerate. Yet, behind the barbed wire, those very sounds became irresistible. The prisoners found themselves tapping their feet or humming along, though they would never admit it out loud. Each song seemed to hint at another kind of world, one where individuality was not punished and joy was not rationed. The guards, mostly young Americans, barely older than the prisoners themselves, noticed the curiosity growing among their captives. Some of them enjoyed showing off their own culture, sharing small fragments of home. A few brought records to the camp, letting Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, or Glenn Miller fill the air with swinging brass and rhythm. The German soldiers listened intently, their expressions caught between fascination and discomfort. Some smiled, others turned away, pretending not to care. But even the ones who resisted could not ignore the melodies. Music had become a mirror, reflecting back the deep cultural divide between the world they had come from and the one they now inhabited. Within the barracks, this difference became a subject of quiet reflection. One evening, as the lights dimmed, a former music student from Dresden spoke softly to his bunkmates. "They play without order," he said, "yet it makes sense. It feels free." His words hung in the air, neither challenged nor embraced. In that simple observation lay the core of the cultural conflict that unfolded behind the fences. The German soldiers had been raised to see music as a tool of precision and pride, something to be mastered in service of the state. The Americans used it to express individuality and joy. That divergence struck deeper than ideology. It revealed how differently the two worlds understood what it meant to be human. Tensions sometimes rose when those worlds clashed. A few camp officers viewed the spreading influence of American music with suspicion. They ordered the prisoners to maintain discipline, forbidding them to mimic the corrupt styles they heard. But prohibition only deepened curiosity. Late at night, when the guards had passed and the camp was quiet, someone would softly whistle a tune from the radio. Soon, others joined, creating a faint harmony that floated through the sleeping quarters. Even those who disapproved listened in silence, secretly comforted by the sound. The contrast between their upbringing and their new surroundings had become the emotional pulse of their captivity. Over time, the conflict shifted from fear to fascination. The prisoners began to see that the music symbolized something larger than entertainment. It was the sound of a society unbroken by war, a culture that seemed to thrive on creativity rather than obedience. Some began to question the truths they had believed for years. How could people capable of such music be the monsters they had been told to fight? In this realization, small cracks appeared in the mental walls that propaganda had built. Through rhythm and melody, an unspoken dialogue began between two opposing worlds, one built on control, the other on freedom. Yet, even as they listened, the prisoners remained uneasy. The melodies brought comfort, but also reminded them of their loss. They were hearing the sounds of liberty from behind fences designed to confine them. It was a cruel irony that the freest music they had ever known reached them only in captivity. Still, the contrast between silence and song, discipline and improvisation, began to change them. By the time spring arrived, many could no longer separate the idea of America from the music they heard every day. The war was still raging far away, but inside those camps, the battle between fear and understanding was being fought in every note that drifted across the wire. Long before the first notes filled the air of the prison camps, American officials had already learned an important lesson about the psychology of war. By 1943, the United States was hosting more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, spread across hundreds of camps from Texas to Wisconsin. The task was monumental. These were men trained for discipline, loyalty, and suspicion. Keeping them orderly required more than barbed wire and guards. The War Department soon realized that idle men were dangerous men, and that routine alone could not contain the restless energy of thousands of former soldiers. Something was needed to occupy their minds, something that could transform confinement into cooperation. And so, quietly, music began to enter the life of the camps. At first, it was unplanned. A few captured musicians asked for instruments, hoping to pass the time. Some American officers, many of whom were music lovers themselves, granted the requests. An old piano was moved into a recreation hut, and violins were donated by local communities. Soon, guitars, harmonicas, and brass instruments followed. The camps began to hum with sound. The prisoners, most of whom had received strong musical education in pre-war Germany, quickly organized small ensembles. What began as casual entertainment soon grew into something far more structured. In several camps, orchestras emerged, complete with conductors, sheet music, and schedules. Music became an official part of daily life, a sanctioned activity under the watchful eye of the US Army. Behind these developments lay an unspoken understanding. Culture could be a form of control. American officials recognized that allowing artistic expression not only kept morale high, but also reduced resistance. A man with a violin in his hands was less likely to cause trouble. But what no one fully predicted was how deeply the music would affect both sides of the wire. For the prisoners, it reawakened a sense of dignity and purpose that war had stripped away. For the guards, it humanized the men they were ordered to watch. When the orchestras performed for visiting officers or local townspeople, applause would rise, mingling German melodies with American voices. For a brief moment, the lines between captor and captive blurred. Many of the prisoners who joined these musical groups had professional backgrounds. Some had played in conservatories or military bands before the war. Others were self-taught musicians who had carried their skills through the battlefield. Inside the camps, they rediscovered themselves. They rehearsed tirelessly, their breath visible in the cold air of winter mornings, their fingers raw from practice. The barracks became rehearsal rooms, and the sound of scales and tuning filled the compound. Even those who had never played began to join, clapping, singing, or learning new instruments. The camp commandants noted that discipline improved, tempers cooled, and the atmosphere softened. It was as if the act of making music had restored a fragile sense of normal life. Gradually, American influences began to shape what the prisoners played. At first, they performed only the classical pieces of Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms, clinging to the familiar. But as time passed, curiosity took hold. Prisoners began to request American songs they had heard over the camp loudspeakers or from the guards' radios. They tried to mimic the swing rhythms of Glenn Miller and the harmonies of popular American tunes. Some laughed at their own attempts, struggling to capture the improvisational energy of jazz. Yet each effort brought them closer to understanding the culture of their captors. Music, once a boundary, became a bridge. In some camps, the US Army encouraged this cultural exchange more openly. Commanders organized small concerts where both prisoners and guards performed together. A clarinet from a German orchestra might accompany a guitar played by an American guard. Audiences of both nationalities listened, smiling in the dim light of recreation halls. For many, it was the first time they had seen the other side not as a soldier, but as a fellow human being. The sound of applause, echoing against the wooden walls, became a kind of truce. Behind every song lay an unspoken truth, that art could reach places where politics could not. The origins of this musical life were not merely about entertainment. They revealed something profound about resilience and adaptation. Stripped of freedom, the German prisoners rebuilt a form of society within their confinement, using sound as their foundation. Music gave them purpose, structure, and a way to reclaim their identity. For the Americans, it was a demonstration of their own values. The belief that humanity, even in war, could be preserved through decency and culture. As months turned into years, the presence of music became as natural as the daily roll call. The camps were still prisons, but within them grew something far larger than control. A living dialogue between two nations at war. By late 1944, that dialogue had matured into an unspoken tradition. Each camp had its own rhythm, its own soundscape. Some orchestras performed weekly concerts, while smaller groups played during holidays or after labor shifts. Prisoners wrote letters home describing the strange, almost surreal coexistence they experienced. "We live behind wire," one wrote, "but we play Beethoven every night." Others mentioned learning American songs, their tone somewhere between amusement and awe. What had started as a method of management had become a shared experience of humanity. The music no longer belonged to one side or the other. It belonged to the men who, for a moment, had found harmony in the midst of war. Looking back, the origins of this phenomenon seem almost accidental, yet they shaped one of the most remarkable aspects of captivity during World War II. The introduction of music transformed the camps from silent holding grounds into living cultural spaces. It bridged a gap that no speech or order could close. Within the wire, violins, trumpets, and voices carried messages of longing, loss, and hope. For the German POWs, these sounds would become inseparable from their memories of America. They would remember not the guards' rifles or the fence's sharp edges, but the strange and beautiful music that filled their confinement with life. It was there, in the origins of those simple songs, that the seeds of understanding were first planted. By the time the orchestras and choirs had taken root inside the camps, the battlefields of Europe were still echoing with explosions and cries. Yet within those distant fences in America, the war took on a different rhythm. The German POWs were no longer soldiers in the traditional sense, but their minds still fought silent wars, battles of guilt, memory, and fear. It was in this psychological terrain that music made its most powerful impact. For the prisoners, the daily repetition of captivity was its own kind of front line, and music became the one weapon that did not destroy. It soothed, it connected, and it reminded them that they were more than just defeated soldiers. To understand what music meant to these men, one must imagine their world. The clang of metal trays at mealtime, the barking of orders during roll call, the endless shuffle of boots across gravel. These were the sounds of their new existence. The war, once defined by the thunder of artillery, had become a war of waiting. Yet when a violin began to play, or a harmonica sang softly across the barracks, something shifted. The dull routine broke open for a moment of beauty. Men stopped talking, some closed their eyes, and for a few fleeting minutes, they were home again. The battlefield they had lost in Europe was replaced by one within themselves, fought in silence and memory. American guards, too, were affected by this transformation. At first, they viewed the prisoners as faceless enemies, dangerous and hardened by ideology. But music began to erode those assumptions. When a group of prisoners performed a concert in the recreation hall, Guards stood at the back, listening in quiet amazement. The precision of the German orchestras, their emotion, their discipline, it contradicted every stereotype of the enemy. One guard later recalled in a letter home that he had been moved to tears hearing a POW orchestra play Schubert's Ave Maria. He wrote that for the first time, he understood that the men inside the wire were fathers, sons, and brothers, not just soldiers of a fallen regime. This subtle shift in perception had practical consequences as well. Discipline improved, tensions eased, and the camps became less volatile. The War Department took note of the unusual calm within music-rich facilities. Commanders began to encourage cultural programs more widely, including theatre and art, alongside orchestral performances. The prisoners' morale rose, and the guards' workload lightened. Even small gestures, like allowing instruments or providing a radio, became acts of mutual respect. The battlefield that once divided captor and captive was being redrawn, not by treaties, but by shared human experience. For the German prisoners, the act of making music was also a way to reclaim agency. They had lost their freedom, their uniforms, and their national pride. Yet through performance, they regained a sense of identity. Each rehearsal was a quiet declaration that they were still men capable of creation, not just symbols of defeat. In the dim light of the camp halls, they played not for victory, but for survival. Some wrote new compositions, blending the melancholic tones of European tradition with the rhythms of American jazz. Others took comfort in familiar hymns or lullabies. Their instruments became their voices, carrying unspoken prayers for families far away and uncertain futures. In many ways, the camps became a reflection of the world they had left behind. A smaller, safer version of the war's shattered landscape. But unlike the battlefields, this one was governed by cooperation instead of conflict. When a German orchestra played for an American audience, the applause that followed was more than politeness. It was a kind of surrender to shared emotion. Guards and prisoners alike felt something beyond orders and uniforms. In those brief concerts, the idea of enemy lost its meaning. The music did not erase the war, but it softened its edges. It reminded everyone listening that humanity could survive even the most brutal divisions. There were moments when the music carried even deeper symbolism. During Christmas of 1944, in several camps across the Midwest, German choirs performed traditional carols alongside American counterparts. The blend of languages, Stille Nacht and Silent Night, filled the cold air with harmony. Some guards joined in, their voices uncertain but sincere. For a moment, the war outside the fences seemed to stop. The sound of unity was fragile, almost unbelievable. Yet it lingered long after the songs had ended. That night, the men slept more peacefully than they had in months. The battlefield was far away, but its shadow lifted, replaced by something like grace. The impact of music within the camps could not be measured in victories or losses, yet its effects were undeniable. The men who once charged across foreign soil now found themselves facing their own hearts. The melodies they heard and created became their refuge, a defense against despair. Each note, each harmony, each echo across the barracks was a small act of defiance against the silence of defeat. The battlefield had changed shape, from the mud and blood of Europe to the invisible struggle of captivity. And in that struggle, music became both shield and solace. It taught the prisoners, and perhaps the guards as well, that not all wars were fought with weapons. As months passed and news of Germany's crumbling front reached the camps, the music took on a heavier tone. Performances became quieter, slower, more reflective. The once bright curiosity for American tunes gave way to nostalgia for home. Yet even in sorrow, the act of playing held power. It was their way of mourning, their way of remembering. Behind the wire, far from the battlefields that had defined their fate, the German POWs had found another kind of front, a place where art replaced aggression, and where the music of humanity continued to play, even amid the ruins of war. As the months turned into years, the quiet experiment of music behind the fences began to ripple far beyond the camps themselves. What had started as a form of control and morale soon evolved into an unexpected bridge between nations. American communities living near the camps began to hear rumors of concerts performed by German prisoners. At first, there was skepticism. Locals who had lost family members in the war hesitated to show sympathy for those who had once been their enemies. But curiosity proved stronger than anger. Slowly, civilians began attending the concerts, filling small halls or gathering outside the wire to listen. What they heard often left them silent, surprised by the depth and sincerity of the performances. The music had begun to soften something deep within the American public. Listeners who had expected arrogance or resentment found humility instead. The German POW orchestras performed with precision and emotion, playing Beethoven and Brahms alongside American folk songs that the Guards had taught them. Some performances ended with the audience clapping in rhythm and even smiling through tears. The applause, simple yet powerful, carried across the fences and echoed through the camps. It was the sound of a fragile reconciliation taking shape, not through words or treaties, but through the universal language of sound. In the shared quiet after each song, there was no enemy, only humanity. For the prisoners, these encounters were transformative. Many had entered captivity filled with suspicion and defiance. The Reich had told them that Americans were decadent and cruel, incapable of culture or discipline. Yet in the small towns of Texas, Oklahoma, and Georgia, they found people who treated them not as monsters, but as men. Music became the first and truest form of diplomacy. When prisoners played a local tune on the violin or joined American guards in singing "You Are My Sunshine," a wall crumbled. Laughter replaced fear. For the first time, some prisoners began to question everything they had been taught about the world beyond Germany. The realization was quiet but profound. Their captors were not the demons of propaganda. They were ordinary people, capable of kindness and art. The Americans, too, were changed. Many guards had entered their duties with resentment or contempt, viewing the German prisoners as dangerous ideologues. Yet after months of shared concerts, their perception began to shift. Some spoke of feeling a strange respect for the prisoners' discipline and artistry. Others admitted that the music had humanized the men they were ordered to contain. A few even took up correspondence with former prisoners after the war. Friendships that lasted for decades. These were small gestures, perhaps invisible on the scale of history, but powerful on the scale of the heart. The war was still raging overseas, yet within the camps, small acts of understanding were taking root. Not all reactions were positive. In some areas, local newspapers criticized the idea of entertaining prisoners, while American soldiers were still dying abroad. "Let them work, not sing," one editorial wrote. Yet even these protests revealed how unusual the situation was. The existence of music among captives defied the usual logic of war. It blurred the moral lines between victor and vanquished. Despite occasional outrage, the programs continued, partly because they worked. The camps with the most active orchestras saw fewer escape attempts and fewer acts of violence. The US Army quietly acknowledged that music had succeeded where intimidation might have failed. It had turned resentment into resignation and hostility into cooperation. Within the German ranks, music also became a subtle form of cultural survival. For those who had lost faith in the Reich, it offered a reminder of a Germany that existed before Hitler. A Germany of art, intellect, and emotion. Playing Mozart or Schubert became an act of remembrance, a way to reclaim their nation's soul from the chaos of ideology. Some began to write their own songs reflecting on their strange new world. The lyrics spoke of homes far away, of uncertainty, and sometimes of admiration for the vast, quiet land that held them captive. In the process, many rediscovered a sense of identity that had little to do with the regime they had once served. As word spread through letters and reports, the phenomenon caught the attention of post-war scholars and diplomats. They saw in it a glimpse of how culture could shape peace as much as war. When Germany finally surrendered in 1945, many of these same prisoners carried their memories home as living proof of another way of life. They had seen a country untouched by the devastation of Europe, a place where freedom of expression was not just tolerated, but celebrated. And in their minds, that freedom was inseparable from the music they had heard. It became a symbol of America itself, a melody that would echo in their memories long after they left its shores. For the guards and Americans who witnessed it, the experience left an equally lasting mark. Some later said that those concerts were among the first moments they believed reconciliation could be possible. It was not politics or speeches that convinced them, but the sight of men once sworn to fight them playing a violin with trembling hands, or singing softly in a language not their own. Through that exchange, the camps became unlikely classrooms for empathy. The war had divided the world, but inside those fences, a quiet counterpoint was being written. A reminder that even in the darkest times, beauty could endure. By the end of the war, the wider consequences of music in US camps were undeniable. The performances had not only changed the mood of captivity, they had reshaped the way two enemies saw each other. The German POWs left America carrying not just memories of confinement, but lessons in humanity. And for many Americans, those same men had ceased to be faceless foes. The music had done something the war itself could not. It had turned opposition into recognition. It had shown that in the clash of nations, there remained a shared rhythm that no ideology could silence. By the winter of 1945, the rhythm of life in the camps had taken on a strange and fragile peace. The men inside knew that Germany was collapsing, that their homeland was being pounded by bombs, and that families they had not seen in years might be gone. Letters, when they arrived, carried news of loss and ruin. Yet even as the prisoners absorbed these grim realities, they turned once again to the one thing that still gave them meaning: music. The rehearsals became more frequent, the performances more emotional. It was as if the men were preparing not for another concert, but for a farewell to the war, to their comrades, and to the version of themselves that had marched off to battle years earlier. One of the most powerful scenes played out on a cold December night. Snow had fallen across the camp, blanketing the barbed wire and softening the usual harsh edges of confinement. Inside the recreation hall, hundreds of prisoners gathered for what would be their final winter concert. The makeshift stage was decorated with paper stars and pine branches. A piano stood at the center, its keys worn smooth from months of use. As the lights dimmed, the conductor, a thin man with a graying mustache who had once played for a symphony in Munich, raised his baton. The orchestra began with a piece by Bach, solemn and delicate, filling the hall with a reverent stillness that seemed to stop time itself. Among the guards watching from the back were young Americans barely older than the prisoners they were guarding. Many had been away from home for years as well, their lives equally suspended by war. They stood quietly as the music swelled, unsure whether to salute or simply listen. When the orchestra shifted to a medley of carols, something unexpected happened. A guard began to hum along, then another joined. Before long, the prisoners' German verses of Stille Nacht intertwined with the Americans' Silent Night. The blend of languages and voices filled the hall with a haunting beauty. It was the sound of peace before peace had come, a fragile harmony born in the heart of captivity. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world beyond the fence. Inside, when the final note faded, no one moved. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. Men who had once fought each other now shared the same breath, the same stillness. Some of the prisoners wept openly, their tears glistening in the flickering light. A few of the guards turned away, pretending not to see. In that moment, there were no victors or vanquished, no uniforms or flags, only human beings suspended in the quiet aftermath of song. Later, one prisoner wrote in his diary, "We were free for those few minutes. No one could take that from us." That winter concert became a turning point, remembered long after the war ended. It marked the climax of the strange and unexpected transformation that had taken place behind the fences. What had begun as an effort to maintain discipline had become something spiritual, something larger than both captor and captive. The music had built a bridge where none should have existed, a connection that defied propaganda and politics. For the prisoners, it was the moment they stopped feeling like prisoners and began to feel like people again. For the guards, it was the moment they realized that mercy and art could achieve what violence never could. In the weeks that followed, the tone of the camps changed. The prisoners, though still confined, carried themselves differently. There was a sense of quiet acceptance in their movements, as if they had already stepped beyond the war. The guards noticed too, speaking more softly, sometimes lingering to chat rather than bark orders. Even the American officers, usually stoic, seemed moved by what they had witnessed. Some began collecting the prisoners' sheet music and programs, preserving them as mementos of something they could not fully explain. In the midst of global destruction, within the most unlikely of places, beauty had been born. Then, in early spring, the announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. When the news reached the camps, the reaction was complex, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and sorrow. Many prisoners cheered, others sat in silence. They knew that while the guns had stopped, their world had been forever changed. That evening, one final concert was held. There were no speeches, no formal program. The prisoners played softly, choosing simple, familiar tunes. Some guards joined them. As the last notes faded, applause rose from both sides of the wire. It was not loud or triumphant, but steady and sincere, the sound of men acknowledging one another after years of division. That night, as the camp settled into quiet, the snow began to melt and the fences glistened under the moonlight. The war that had brought them together in captivity was ending, but the echoes of that final music would endure. For the men who had played, it was a moment that transcended everything they had known about victory and defeat. It was the climax of their captivity, a point at which they rediscovered what it meant to feel human. They had entered the camps as soldiers of an empire, but they would leave as witnesses to something far greater: the power of music to remind even enemies that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. When the war finally ended, the German prisoners began their slow return home. For many, leaving the United States was bittersweet. They longed for home and family. Yet the camps, those strange worlds of fences, fields, and music, had become places of transformation. As their trains departed across the vast American landscape, the prisoners looked out at the land that had once been their enemy. They remembered not only the guards and the routines, but the melodies that had carried them through their captivity. The music had become the sound of survival, a reminder that even in the heart of defeat, the spirit could endure. It was not something they could pack or leave behind. It had already become part of who they were. Back in Germany, the ruins told a story that no song could soften. Cities lay in ashes, families scattered, and the homeland they had imagined no longer existed. Yet among the returning prisoners, something was different. They had seen another world, one where art and freedom were intertwined rather than controlled. Many spoke quietly about America, not as conquerors, but as human beings who had shown decency even to their captives. Some of the former POW musicians found work rebuilding cultural life in post-war Germany. They joined orchestras, taught in music schools, and carried with them the influences they had absorbed across the ocean. In their performances, subtle hints of jazz and American swing began to appear, small echoes of the sound that had changed them during captivity. Letters and memoirs written years later revealed how deeply those experiences had stayed with them. Some former prisoners wrote about the first time they heard American jazz, or the strange beauty of a mixed-language Christmas carol sung behind wire. They remembered how the guards had listened, how the fences had seemed to disappear, and how those moments had restored their faith in humanity. Others recalled the emotional conflict they felt upon realizing that kindness and culture could exist even in an enemy nation. It was the music that defeated us, one former POW admitted decades later. Not their weapons, but their freedom. His words captured what so many others felt: the quiet, lingering power of those melodies that had carried through their darkest years. For the Americans who had guarded the camps, the legacy was equally profound. Many of them returned home and told their families stories that contrasted sharply with wartime propaganda. They spoke of German prisoners who played Schubert and Bach with aching precision, of choirs that brought men to tears, and of the strange peace that had settled over the camps by the end of the war. Some even kept programs or sheet music as mementos. Others stayed in touch with former prisoners through letters, a remarkable correspondence between once sworn enemies who had found friendship through shared sound. These quiet acts of remembrance became part of the broader post-war reconciliation between the United States and Germany. As time passed, historians began to recognize the significance of what had occurred in those camps. The music was more than a pastime. It had been a silent negotiation, a human bridge built in the middle of global conflict. While diplomats debated the future of nations, the men inside those fences had already begun the work of reconciliation in their own way. In that sense, the concerts and choirs were not just artistic events. They were acts of resistance against the hatred that had defined the war. Through rhythm and harmony, the prisoners and their guards had written a different kind of history, one measured not in battles or victories, but in compassion and understanding. Today, the story of music in the POW camps remains one of the lesser-known chapters of World War II, yet it holds a resonance that transcends time. In museums and archives across both countries, faded photographs show rows of men in plain uniforms, holding violins and trumpets, their faces caught between fatigue and hope. The notes they played are long gone, but their meaning endures. They remind us that even in war, the boundaries between enemies are never absolute. Art can survive where ideology cannot. In those small American towns, in wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, a quiet symphony of humanity played its part in healing a broken world. As the years have passed, the former prisoners who once made that music have grown old and passed away, but their stories remain alive in recordings, diaries, and memories shared by their descendants. Each retelling carries the same message: that beauty can rise even from the harshest soil. The German POWs never forgot the music they heard and made in captivity, not because it entertained them, but because it transformed them. It turned fear into understanding, separation into connection, and defeat into renewal. When they remembered America, they did not think first of fences or guards. They remembered the sound, the harmonica at dusk, the violins trembling through winter air, the voices of enemies singing together in a language older than war. It was, and remains, the truest legacy of that time, that even in the silence of conflict, humanity still finds a way to sing.